Okay, there we are. Ed Gillespie, welcome to the listening.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tim.
Yeah, loving the green in the background. Looking at your colours, you've got a sort of red and green thing going on.
Well, yeah.
Sort of browns and reds, and then the bright reds on the door, and then lots of green.
Well, what you can see, because this is actually an old green room. So I live in an old watermill, and this is my office, which is on the deck, but it's actually used to be attached to the old furnace shed when the mill was steam powered back in the day. And my neighbours are both professional musicians, and they ran the old furnace shed as a sort of music and arts venue for some years. And this was the green room where the musicians and artists would prepare before they took to the stage. And then they sold it to the previous owners of this mill. So now it's my office. And the orange in the corner there are actually old Oktoberfest beer tables that I bought as my garden furniture. So they've had like some substantially girthed German beer drinkers dancing on them in the past.
Wow. So is it easy to work in an office that's kind of soaked up all those rock and roll vibes? Yeah.
Well, I think it was mainly classical recitals.
Oh, okay.
They're both pianists, so I think it was more violinists and pianists who were in here. Although they did do a comedy club, so there's been a lot of comedians who've sat in here over the years. I mean, I love it. I mean, just out the door here is the river, so usually I've got the door open, although I'm trying to separate us at least slightly from the sounds of small children who are playing and who are now just dunking jam jars into the water and hoiking out pondweed and bugs and having a whale of a time as they do. But yeah, so usually it's the trickle and tinkle of running water, which is my backdrop. So yeah, it's a very good working space actually. So sometimes hard to tear yourself away from it.
So how are you finding that? Is this the first time you've lived on a river then? Because you're basically on the river, right?
Yeah, I'm actually, the house is actually over the river.
Yeah.
The river runs right underneath my kitchen floor. I did 25 years in London, most of which was in Brixton, and only relocated here about 4 months ago, although this is where I grew up. So it's very much a return to the kith. I spent my teenage years 2 miles up the road. I actually knew the building when I was a kid. So when I bought it, I was like, when I saw it, I was like, hang on, that's the mill. So yeah, I'm loving it. When I lived on one of the biggest arterial routes in South London. I was right on Brixton Hill, the main London Brighton road, with 100 buses an hour going past my window and all the delicious, tasty air pollution that entailed. And then here, I mean, I'm right in the heart of the village because obviously the mill was close to the centre. But on the back of the building, you just look upstream and it's just green. It's like a Monet painting, it's lilies and watercress and willows, and the wildlife's just astonishing. I mean, it was weird during lockdown in Brixton, even though I'd been in the same flat for 20 years, as many people did, I think I had a completely different appreciation for the wild, even around my sort of inner city enclave, beyond the usual foxes, rats and pigeons. Because when the traffic stopped on Brixton Hill, I could hear all the bird life for the first time that had previously been completely suppressed by the noise of the internal combustion engine. And suddenly it was parakeets and jays and magpies, and also I was, as we all were, radically present in the flat because it had to be. And even though I'd lived there for 2 decades, it was such a transition. It was something like, I can have the windows open on both sides of the building. I'm hearing all of this bird life, but also I'm observing it because I'm here all the time. And it was sort of a revelation to watch and understand the different like bird behaviors, which I'd probably just seen in passing before, but
Mm.
you know, I became quite familiar with the way the magpies would hop around the building, basically digging spiders out of the cracks in the walls. You know, they were going around and finding all the little crevices in the brickwork where the arachnids hide, and plucking them out, and watching the rivalry and the bird hierarchies between the different corvids. You know, so you get the big crows who are like just sort of dominating everything, and then the magpies, and then the jays were sort of the slightly flash, you know, plumaged ones, and yeah, it was fantastic. And here I've obviously just got a kind of a massive exponential increase on that. So we've got kingfishers, and I've got a pair of swans who come and feed off the deck every evening. They're probably due about now. They'll turn up and expect their daily bread. And there's a pair of otters that almost live under the deck here.
Nice.
You can hear them squeaking of an evening as they go off fishing. So yeah, it's magical. And I just this lunchtime, I was just sat watching the latest clutch of ducklings, because there was like a dozen ducklings in the litter. Litter? Do you say clutch of ducklings? I don't know what the collective.
I don't know. Maybe it is a clutch. I don't think litter. Maybe it's a clutch.
A clutch of eggs, but
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, that's a good question. Well, we'll find out later.
Yeah, and there's always one or two yellow ones. It's really interesting, and I'd never noticed that before. You know, so you see a dozen ducklings, and then there's two which are like arrow fodder. You know, I don't know if they're kind of, it's a mutation, but these poor yellow ones are obviously the first target for anything that might want to eat a duckling, and you do get to watch that sort of slightly depressing bit as the group of ducklings gets smaller over the weeks as they mature. But this is the way of things.
Yeah, I guess that's why 12, right? So at least, you know, one or two will make it. Yeah. Wow. So do you think that it's interesting to hear the sort of lockdown story of London and the transformation of where you live? So you actually got to live in a new place, or rather you got to experience what was perhaps going on all the time in some way, obviously, but then it could rise to the surface, like the land itself was kind of speaking a bit more loudly because of the quiet. Do you think that was that a major part in why you moved then, or were you already going to move? What was the sort of trigger for moving?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. The answer is complicated. I mean, I'm a full-time single father, following a very sort of difficult and protracted legal process. And it was only when I was awarded that full custody in November last year that I was actually able to move. So I think it had been simmering for a few years, and there's no doubt that the lockdown experience was a contributory factor of just like going, actually, this is a very stark reminder of what I am disconnected from here during normality. And, you know, and I'm one of those people, you know, I trained as a marine biologist. I was always on the beach or by the sea. And then I went to London 25 years ago to do a course, very reluctantly. You know, I was a very reluctant Londoner. And I said, I'll just go for a year, you know, and I, you know, sort of set my sights on that. And then a quarter of a century later, you sort of look around and go, how on earth did that happen? So, yeah, it'd been a long-term plan with multiple triggers. And then once I got the green light in terms of custody, I mean, my daughter's only 4, so I wanted her to have the same sort of rural nature connected childhood that my brothers and I had, because it was so critical to me, I think, to have that freedom and an ability to just, you know, wander and rove and rummage and forage and do all of those things. And it's funny because my daughter's already sort of, in that brilliantly adaptable way that 4-year-olds have, has already post-rationalized it. So she's already said to people, I've overheard her saying to people, when I was in London, I wanted to live in a house with a garden and a river. And I was like,
Oh yeah.
Did you? I don't think you ever said that to me.
Yeah, great.
And she's been telling people she dreamt about our house. And maybe she did, but again, and you'll know as a father that often you hear your children saying things to other people that they never say to you. And it's quite an interesting observation. You go, oh, you can pick, because sometimes they don't communicate stuff to you which they think is just assumed between you. And then you hear the story coming out when it's told to someone else. It's like, oh, actually, I'm learning something from this about what you think.
Yeah, that happens a lot. That does happen a lot. Yeah, wow, that's interesting. So, but water, obviously, marine biologist, obviously that's the sea, but there's a kind of water connection. When you saw the mill, was there a draw because it was on the water, or was it just the building itself, or what kind of? And maybe talk a little bit about your relationship with water, because it's obviously quite important in some way.
No, completely. I mean, you know what it's like when you walk into a building and you get a feeling about it. I mean, the same thing when I bought my flat in Brixton, which was a kind of old 20s flat. It was beautiful, and it was very different to anything else I'd seen when I bought that place. And I knew it's almost as soon as I walked through the door, I just had a feeling. And I had exactly the same feeling when I walked into the mill, not least because the water was very high that day. And so it rushes over the race underneath the building. So in the kitchen, you just have this wonderful sort of white noise burble going on the whole time. But yeah, I mean, the relationship with water is obviously very deep. I mean, I'm a Cancerian, I'm a water sign, I'm terribly emotional and sensitive. And it was forged in, my love of the sea was forged in North Norfolk, actually. I mean, just up the road from you. I spent all my childhood summers in Blakeney, covered head to foot in, black anoxic mud, loving the sulphurousness of it all and the filth, and making little sand drip castles on the beach, on the quayside. So I was always in the sea. And yeah, I'm not on the coast now, but actually I get that wonderful sense of flow, where literally everything is just gently coming. I mean, it's not a fast running river, it's one of those lovely, limpid, muddy rivers. I mean, Loddon, where I live, actually means muddy river in Celtic.
What a great word. It sounds like that, doesn't it? Loddon.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're covered from head to toe in mud and you're not moving very quickly.
No,
I was really Loddon this morning, on my way to work. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to. Do you know the meaning of liff? Have you seen?
Oh, no.
No. Meaning of liff, just as a sort of sidetrack, is a wonderful book by Douglas Adams. The Hitchhiker's Guide to.
Yeah.
And John Lloyd, who is like one of the legendary TV comedy producers, who basically has produced everything that's ever made me laugh in my life. So, Blackadder, QI, not the 9 o'clock news going back. Okay. He's basically produced the whole lot. But the two of them sat down with a list of British place names and made up definitions for them. So you can sort of picture them, the two of them, with a bottle of whiskey, just going, Loddon. That would be, when you're covered from head to foot in black mud. And my favourite one of that is like Sutton and Cheam. And Sutton is black fluff you get on white clothing, and Cheam is white fluff you get on black clothing. Or
they're great words, aren't they?
They are, and they just, they went through and there's a whole book of them, and they just made up. And I've actually done it as a competition thing on pub quizzes, or similar, where I've been away with mates, where you just say, right, we just take the place name of where we are, and you have a competition so you can come up with the best definition of it. So, the Swanton Novas would probably be a good one. I don't quite know where that would steer us.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in there. There's a lot of options with that. It's funny because Swanton, when I was a kid growing up in Manchester, we lived in sort of a part of Salford which was called Swinton, basically same name, you know, Swinetown, pigs. So it's funny to sort of end up here with
No
that
accident.
kind of connection, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I say to people. I said, people say, "Where have you moved to?" I said, "Loddon." It's like London, but with more D's and less X.
Yeah, yeah. That's
I
it.
haven't, I
London
haven't
with
gone
more
far.
D's. That's all it is. But apart from that, very similar. Yeah. Well, the thing about the flow thing kind of interests me because,
Mm,
you know, we are mostly water,
mm,
and as all of life is, you know, it's fascinating just how much water and life are kind of synonymous, really,
mm,
and how much a part of us the kind of water dimension is. So I always feel like it's interesting when you're near water or in water because there's a resonance, obviously, like a profound resonance, and this idea of you living above the flow of the river, it just makes me wonder what effect that has on the body, or
mm.
well, on your whole being, really, you know, because you're constantly in a way being cleansed energetically. It's like, you remember those old you know, when we back in the day when we had tapes, cassette tapes, and you could get those demagnetizers which sort
Yeah,
of wiped the information off. It's almost, I kind of imagine, you know, you're having that done to you all the time, but in a good way, like all the shit, all the kind of stress, all the blocks, all the sort of holding on, whatever. I wonder about that because you know, energetically, it's got to be having an effect on you.
well, that's exactly what it feels like. And yeah, my brother said the same thing. My brother's like a kind of holistic horticulturalist, and very into all of the energy flows, and as a qigong practitioner and all this kind of stuff. And he said, he goes, "This is going to be a very cleansing place for you because, as you say, literally, it's like anything negative. I mean, it's like the stream of consciousness. I remember doing a wilderness retreat in the Pyrenees, and the guy, before we did it was only 24 hours alone on the mountain. It wasn't a full 4-day session, but he said, the biggest danger to you on the mountain is yourself, and is going crazy because you let your thoughts run away with themselves, or you fear something which doesn't need to be feared. And he used the metaphor and just said, just think of it as the stream of consciousness. And when those thoughts emerge, which they will, because your brain is firing off and with all the different stimuli and inspirations and things around you. So just watch them fall into the stream of consciousness and then flow off downstream. And that is genuinely what it feels like here. I mean, I wouldn't want to empirically try and measure it because qualitatively it feels like that. And, just letting it go,
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny. I mean, I know you love your poetry. And I wrote a poem when I first moved in here saying, all my life I felt like I've been trying to go downstream, trying to get into the bigger ocean of possibilities. And yet there was something wonderful about coming up to the headwaters of this little, quirky, muddy river, which doesn't go actually very far beyond my mill upstream. It turns into pretty much a ditch within a mile or so. Mm-hmm. But there was something about the sort of the salmon coming home, or the trout coming home to the native river. I've sort of sniffed it out. It's like, oh no, this is where the source is actually. There's all sorts of fun and adventures in the big ocean, but there's something about this little narrow tributary which never looks the same, in terms of its ephemerality, although it is essentially the same river, but it's always new water coming through, even if it's just trickling slowly along. You never step in the same river twice. And I love that sort of contrast between constant change and then looking like it's not really changing.
Yeah, the two happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, coming back to the source. And there's I don't know if it's particular to East Anglia. I guess it is particular to anywhere beautiful or remarkable, but a lot of people seem to come back when they have kids. From the people I know in Norfolk, so many of them have gone away, gone to London, gone off, done something, And when it was time to have kids, or when they'd had kids, they all come back. They all kind of home. Or there's a significant percentage of the people that I've met who have done exactly that.
Yeah, I mean,
and that must feel, you know, because I haven't, obviously, and that's not going to happen for me, but there must be something really, I imagine something very supportive and grounding and kind of almost ancestral feeling about coming back to the homelands to kind of, you know, take on your to take your turn at the responsibility of parenting the next generation. You know, there's
I definitely feel that. I mean, I was away for 30 years, you know, so I was away for 2/3 of my life, and you know, I only very recently returned, but yes, there was definitely that sense of home coming. And it's interesting, you know, it's not just about trying to give my daughter that experience. I think there's something, for me, there's something both bigger and deeper about these very low-lying lands. You know, we joke, you know, in the Broads, don't we, that, you know, 1 meter above sea level is the uplands. Mm-hmm. So for anyone who loves hills or who loves rocks, you know, and I know you've talked about that before in these sessions, you know, is that you know, that solidity. It's like there's something dramatically impermanent about this landscape, which sort of makes it more special. And I joke about that with the mill, because, you know, I've spent the last 20 years of my life working on climate change in some way, shape or form. And it was a big decision to commit to moving here, because it's only 2.5 meters above sea level.
Yeah,
you know?
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know whether this place is going to make it. You know, that's very much in question. It's got a while in it. I think even in the worst case scenarios, you know, it'll probably see out the end of this century, but it might not be much for my daughter. You know, he'll still be around. So there's some, I jokingly call this place the Mill of Impermanence, because, you know, it's not going to last. You know, this is land that has come out of the sea and will probably go back into the sea. And there's something sort of magical about that. And I sort of reconciled it myself, like going, well, I want to be a steward of this place and be a resident and be owned by this soil. Because when it goes, it's been celebrated and it's been loved and it's been properly lived on while it's been there. And then when the sea takes it back, you know, the starfish can have it, and the bottom feeding fish.
Yeah, and I suppose in a way all land is like that. You know, the sea might come and swallow your bit, but it's also the weather is wearing away, and the river, you know, is eroding the high ground. So it's all being wiped clean.
Yeah.
You know, and obviously depending on your timescales, everything's going. You know, everything's on the move. I wonder if you're maybe there's some unconscious going to meet the climate change, you know, face to face, like really to live it, to go to those edges where it's maybe going to impact more visibly, more quickly, because, you know, obviously even if it's not the sea level rising, the increased weather that we're already seeing means flooding's going to be more of a thing.
Yeah.
Right? So you're going to be, you know, you're going to be kind of like having your big toe right in the kind of what would it be? It's the sort of early warning system, isn't it? And you're right there dangling your feet in it, so you'll be the first to know in a way.
Yeah, it's a move to the front line. I mean, it's interesting because we had the once in 60-year flood at Christmas before I moved in.
Oh, right.
And I was staying down near Bungay at the time. And I went down to visit a friend of mine who lived by the Waveney. And I'd never seen the Waveney Valley, you know, so full of water. I mean, it was quite astonishing because, you know, it literally floods across the marshes for miles, and it looks like the Fens. It looks like an inland sea. Mm-hmm. It's quite sort of magical and mysterious when it happens, because it does look like the landscape has completely changed. And the similar thing happened in Loddon, in the kind of catchment of the Upper Chet, river. And my neighbours, you know, they literally had the water about a centimetre from the top of their door sill. It didn't quite come in. Again, the mill sits above the river, so it sort of escaped, actually.
Yeah.
And
It's designed for it.
Yeah, and it's, again, there's a sort of, you know, human influence here, because the natural flow of the river has been changed. When the mill was built in the 18th century, they actually diverted the river in order to get, you know, a straight run in, so they could control the flow of the water, get the right speed. And so when it floods, actually just the town allotments, the village allotments are just next door. And the river just goes back to its natural course. It just floods straight across the allotments and goes around, you know, so it may back up a little bit here, doesn't come into the building, but sort of pushes it around the side. You know, and we all know how pointless it is to try and resist these forces when they're unleashed.
So, have you got any of the original machinery or workings? I mean, you said it was steam, so they obviously did. Were they using steam and water, or were they just taking the water as a source of?
No, I sort of skipped a bit. So the mill actually, yeah, and in answer to the first question, yes, there's quite a lot of the heavy cogs and the heavy wheels, which would have had drive belts left within the building. I've got some millstones in the garden. But yeah, the mill was originally water powered, and it actually represents the energy transition in a way. So it was water powered, and then post-industrial revolution, they built a big steam furnace, and then that was decommissioned, and then it was run on electricity, and it was only decommissioned as a mill in 1968, so relatively recently, as far as mills go. But the more interesting bit for me, apart from that energy transition, and then, you know, reclamation by nature and by people, you know, there's something magical, because the mill stopped milling flour, and then in the last decades of its life, it was actually doing a very specific, quite precision milling of red clover seeds, red trefoil seeds, dehusking them. And those red clover seeds were then exported all over Europe as a soil restorative, because obviously they're nitrogen fixing and leguminous. A lot of them were exported to Germany after the Second World War. And this mill was actually the UK's biggest producer of those regenerative seeds. So I only found this out, you know, after I moved in, and I was like going, well, I love the poetry of that. You know, so
fantastic.
My mill was the biggest source of restorative seeds in the UK.
Wow, that is interesting, isn't it? God, yeah.
Which is kind of the way I like to, you know, try and think about my work in some way, shape, or form these days. So it felt like there was an alignment. You know, I sort of describe myself in some ways as sort of recovering sustainability consultant.
Yeah, interesting. So, well, it just brings up something in me. I keep describing myself as, well, two things: a recovering idealist and a recovering perfectionist. And it's one day at a time. It really is. It really is. But was this a time in your life also, this move, when you were changing direction, because you're kind of hinting at it, or something? Obviously parenthood is a change, but in terms of you and your work and your kind of outlook on the rest of your life, is it a turning point this time for you?
I think completely. I mean, you know, I'm 49, so I get the half century next year with luck. And you know, you do take a different perspective, I think, when you approach 50, because you know it's quite clear that probably, you know, well over half your life is behind you. You can't. I heard the writer David Keenan talking about it the other day. Just goes, you don't get so many new restarts after 50. You know, you can reinvent yourself loads of times up until then, but yeah, and you know, and I'd worked in consultancy mainly with large businesses, and I ran my own agency with my co-founder and business partner for 18 years. But the nagging doubt had, you know, yeah, like you were saying, I'm sort of recovering idealist and recovering perfectionist. The doubts had already started to creep in about 5 years ago. Just look, you look back and you go, okay, so what difference have we actually made here? And it was very hard to find evidence which would justify what we were doing. And that was quite difficult for me in terms of my own identity. It's like going, well, I'm positioning myself as this sort of change maker, and on that front, it's a bit of an abject failure. So I had a bit of a sort of long, dark twilight of the soul, which was then completely immersed into darkness when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2018 came out, not even the latest one, but in 2018, I read that report and I was like, oh, bugger, this is the reality check, we're not going to get through this in the way that I've been thinking we could. And it was such a sort of rude wake-up call. I just lost not my optimism entirely, although I don't talk about myself as an optimist now. I still have some hope, but maybe the hope is based on different reasons. But having been one of those people who sort of had banged the drum of positive behavioral psychology and the potentiality of change and the importance of having an optimistic I was on my knees, and it did ultimately lead in some way, shape or form to a massive falling out with my business partner and my rather blunt and rude exit from the company that I'd co-founded after nearly 20 years. I can't really talk about that for legal reasons, but it was pretty horrific. And it made me think, well, now what I'm going to do now is I am just going to speak my truth, and not in a like, I'm not going to tell people off, but I always used to joke, my style was insultancy, sort of being strategically rude to people, often using humor to say, look, what you're doing is bollocks. If you're serious, and let's just have an honest conversation, if you're serious that that's the challenge and that's what the challenge says needs to be done, and you're doing this, that's bullshit. And I would just do a lot of that, comparison and just say, we need to satirize the ridiculous way we're currently doing things, because otherwise that's where we're headed. And then obviously the last 3 years has just intensified that, and the report from the IPCC a week or so ago is just like, hey, in unequivocal, inevitable, irreversible, still got a chance, but oh my god, that we've still got a chance is like a squeak now. And I think all of that compounded, with a sort of a parenting battle, with the fact that I just wanted to do something different with the rest of my life, not have because I worked creatively. It was a sustainability communications agency, which we also did some strategy, but we were writing the creative messaging for these big businesses, talking about how marvelous they were doing on their sustainability credentials, and I just didn't believe my own words. And so I couldn't do it, with my hand on my heart. Some people I think still have the belief. Others I think are a bit more cynical and going, well, hey, it pays the bills, or we're sort of caught in these financial ties with the lives that we've built, so we have to keep doing that work. I wrote a big piece about it this week, called The Omerta of Consultancy, the sort of Southern Italian code of silence.
Yeah.
Because that's what it feels like. It's like no one's calling this. No one's calling it for what it actually is, which is, inherently superficial. And we can bang on about it till the cows come home, but the substantive work is so dramatically transformative and probably almost impossible to do within the existing system. And we could have an endless conversation about the system, but I always go back to the economic anthropologist Jason Hickel, who said, capitalist economics is the primary driver of ecological destruction and then positions itself as the primary way of salvation. It's like, hang on, there's a paradox here I can't quite unpick. But yeah, so that's why I've ended up doing more of the writing and provocation. And I've always been pretty direct in the talks I give. But that's where the poetry's come from as well, because it just felt like going back to an essence, my creativity not being prostituted, for want of a better word, to some corporate vested interest, and actually letting the creativity flow and seeing what comes out, not responding to a client brief that I no longer have faith in.
Yeah, God, you touch on so much there. There's this. It's interesting because I've been through not similar in that I wasn't so enmeshed in the kind of corporate tyranny that's how I see it. It's like we're living in a time of corporate tyranny. It's really, it's the corporations have taken over pretty much every aspect of life now, and they're consuming life. It's seemingly that's how they live, is by consuming ecosystems basically, or resources, and just chewing it all up. And there seems, I'm very much on the edges, and I guess I always have been, which sometimes is a good place to see things because you've got a bit of perspective. But I do sense that this kind of silence you talk about, there is also this growing, to me it looks like a growing understanding of how misdirected and how fucked it all is, this machine that we're all in, and that the belief in it, or the stories that people concoct to enable them to carry on participating, are getting harder and harder to hear, in their own heads. And I do feel there's a sort of dropping away of the belief of what they're doing, and a hollowing out, or a kind of thinning. The analogy I have is like, it's kind of like newsprint or something. It's getting thinner and thinner, or like the set in a kind of Western where it's just the surface of everything now, but that's becoming paper thin, and you can just poke it with your finger and you go right through it, and there's nothing behind it. And we're kind of living culturally in this paper thin reality. And I just sense that most people, even if they're massively invested in it, which many people are just by default of being born here, the belief in it is dropping away quickly. And I think your story, we're going to see more and more people trying to kind of do something with what they have of their lives that feels more authentic. And maybe for you it sounds like perhaps finding a way that you can actually realize your ambitions, even if they're maybe more humble than they might have been in your 20s, where you can actually do something really obvious and measurable in your own life, in your own circumstances, with the people around you, that deeply is a right and true and good thing. So, that I see a lot of that. And I felt I've kind of been looking for this my whole life, but I did it in a weird sort of, I went off in retreat from the world when I left London about 18 years ago. And I came to the woods, and I kind of went off into the woods and got lost. I did stuff here, but I was very much, I'd given up on the world. It's like the world's fucked. I could see what was coming even back then. And I did all when I was in London, I was a sort of artist trying to bring down capitalism or something. I don't know what I was trying to do, but I didn't succeed. And I just kind of crawled away from it and just thought, there's nothing I can do about that. I was swimming so hard against the tide, and I was still going backwards and drowning. So I kind of came here and escaped, but unwittingly, I fell into a kind of deep ecological training program that I didn't know I was doing, just by living in very close relationship with the land. And it was and it's been working on me all this time. And I really fell in love with it as well. It was a love affair, still is, you know, and I started to see and feel and experience how much the earth and being a part of a completely woven landscape of plants and animals and fungi and atmosphere and weather, being totally immersed in that, as we all are, whether we know it or not, but being consciously immersed in it and actively building those relationships and working with a place. I just realized just how much of all the things we were looking for, it seemed, or all the holes that we fill with addictions were really just one hole, and it was that we'd lost contact with the land, with ourselves, with our deeper, greater selves, you know. And that kind of realization and this sense now, really, in this last year, as I reached 50 this year, so similar kind of story to you, and just thinking, fuck, if I don't do the things I want to do now, I'm not going to have time, because who knows, you know, once you pass 50, it's like, well, I don't know how long I'm going to live. I may get ill and die in 5 years, or, you know, next week or whatever. So there's a real kind of sense of speak your truth. When you said that, all I want to do now is just share what I know, speak my truth, and make sure I can do whatever I can do for my kids, for my community, you know, for life, really. And there's a lot I've learned in this time, that not that I'm qualified to share it, but I can open a door and say, if you go through there and spend some time doing that, you're going to get something profound. I'm not going to give it you. It's not coming from me, but I know the way, and I know, you know, there's that. And I really, what I'm doing now here where I live, just at the beginning of kind of relaunching and focusing everything into one effort now, is just creating a space where people can come and find connection again with the land, with themselves, with each other, you know. And in that whole way, it's healing, it's creative, it's inspiring, it feeds you, it's full of resources, it's got everything you need and more, you know. It's and that's an inspiring and beautiful thing. I mean, I'm constantly amazed. I love that you're living by the river and seeing the subtle changes, because you'll get so into that. I can see over time the cycle of the seasons, all the different behaviors of the plants and animals, and every single year it's different.
Yeah.
Every single day something new you've never seen before sort of waves at you. It's endlessly fascinating.
It is. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about that presence. As you say, it's, you know, it's impossible to get bored, but you're just changing your horizon down to a level of intimacy, I think. You know, one of my big inspirations has been, you know, Dr. Martin Shaw, who runs the School of Myth, and he talks about it as how forgiving the land is, you know, even if it's been relatively ravaged. You know, he said that intimacy of reconnection and relationship means that restoration can actually happen relatively rapidly, both of the land itself, and of you. You know, even if you've been like me, a sort of, you know, accidental quarter of a century, you know, inner city London urbanite, suddenly I'm back here with filthy fingernails and loving every minute of it. But also just it's the little stories that just pop up all the time. And I mean, I'm sure you get this immersed in your little woodland glade. But I mean, I was sat with my daughter just yesterday, and I thought about this because I thought I'll share this with Tim. And we were just sat on a little wooden step on the edge of the river, and we were looking, you know, at the various different water fleas and beasties and stuff, and dragonflies going about their business. And this little tiny stickleback, you know, literally swam up right in front of us. It was almost, it felt like it was looking up out of the water. I was sat on the bank. I thought, hang on, that fish is swimming a bit weirdly. And then when it turned side on, the poor thing had its tail bitten clean off. I mean, probably by a pike or something that had been in hot pursuit of it. the poor thing had no tail fin, and so it was just sort of, you know, swimming around like this with no power. And it, you know, and I felt so sorry for it. But, you know, I'm sat there thinking, you know, I've now got a kind of broken heart because I'm sharing this, I'm empathizing with this little stickleback. And it's just stuff like that all the time. And I, you know, I love it. I love watching the kingfisher when it comes for his breakfast. Yeah, you know, and he's just sat there patiently on the rope, you know, and he's ready to go in as soon as, or she, I've not actually worked out the gender of the kingfisher yet, but they're fiercely territorial, so I'm assuming it's a he, but I could be completely wrong. That might be my own inbuilt unaddressed misogyny. But, you know, I love those little dramas, you know, which are happening on that sort of microcosmic scale. Where I remember I used to do this thing with people at festivals, you know, never mind, like you're saying, you know, get people to go and spend a few hours in a beautiful woodland. But I just used to get people to lie on the ground and do a micro safari, you know, sort of, as it's literally a 10-centimeter journey, you know, from A to B.
Yeah.
With their nose, you know, 5 or 6 centimeters from the ground. People love it, you know. It's like, oh my God, there's so much going on down there. I know. When was the last time, or perhaps ever in your life, you even paid attention to it, unless David Attenborough was spooning it into you via the TV? There's nothing wrong with that.
It's got to be exotic and somewhere far away, and no, it's happening right here, right under your feet, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's constant, isn't it? And there's a holiness as well that I get from animals, especially the bigger ones. There's just something so profound about meeting a wild animal because they're so completely present and there all the time, and that they emanate a kind of quality of presence which I now just, it's so powerful. Even a little rabbit or a hare has it, and they're just standing there in it and showing you, this is it, this is what you do. Come and get a bit of this. This is fucking amazing. I mean that, but they're not doing it in that human way, you know, they're just being it. And I've noticed it more and more, and its effect on me, the contrast probably, and the greatness of the contrast, you know. And the only word I've got is it's holy. It's like I'm, you know, seeing a vision of like Mary or something, you know, if I was Catholic. It's holy. They're just standing there and they're shining in their presence.
Yeah.
It's so moving, so moving.
Reverence. It's reverence. They always say only the righteous see the kingfisher, which is like an old saying apparently, because they're really small birds.
Yeah. They flash. You know, you see the blue flash, don't you?
Exactly. You catch them out of the corner of your eye and they're gone. You know, but you know, and there's always a symbolism to these things if you choose it, because I think it is that reverence. Like the first few days when I moved in here, the old owners left a little rowing boat. And you know, first couple of days I was just immersed in like unpacking boxes, you know, the usual chaos of a house move. And my daughter was at nursery, and I sort of paused and I stood on the deck and I was like, oh yeah, mental to-do list, what am I going to do next? And I was like, Ed Gillespie, get in that fucking boat.
Yeah.
So why haven't you got in the fucking boat?
Yeah. Why wasn't that top of the list?
I know, exactly. You know, sort of kick yourself going, what are you thinking? So like straight away in the boat, rowed up the river. You know, and you go up like only a couple 100 meters, and you just enter this sort of cathedral of trees, completely overgrown, nobody's houses sort of backing onto it. It's like this sort of wild tunnel of bird song. It's fantastic. And I sort of, you know, paddled along and just sort of sat there amongst the lilies going, this is just stunning and gorgeous and holy. You know, I mean, it felt like a cathedral. And then as I was coming back to the mill, just so I was approaching, the huge heron just sort of flew down and stood on the bank and just sort of turned and looked at me. And I thought, like, well, if that's not a welcome sign, I don't know what it is. You know? Yeah. It's like, come on in. I mean, I had this extraordinary one. I must tell you this because it's a brilliant story. Just when I was doing my wilderness quest in the Pyrenees, and so I'd camped out overnight. And the next day, it was in December, but it was really warm. And I was sat right on the edge of this cliff, in this little kind of rocky stone circle. And I'd obviously taken off all my clothes, so I'm sort of sat there naked, enjoying the sun, feeling at one, all one time. It was lovely. And then I heard this sort of skittering of rocks on the slope behind me through the undergrowth, and I thought, and my first thought was, oh shit, it's hikers. And I'm sat here, naked.
Ramblers, fucking ramblers, like
fucking ramblers
with a map.
Yeah. I go exactly, and I'm like going
in day glow plastic.
Yeah, all right, yeah, I know, I've got no clothes on, whatever. And then it got closer, and then it was this absolutely enormous, like curly horned white mountain goat. I mean, this thing was massive. And I sort of, I realised he came right up onto the edge of my like rocky step. It was only about sort of 10, 12 feet away from me. And I realised then, because I was sort of motionless, I sort of blended in, because I wasn't wearing, as you say, a day glow anorak. I was quiet, I was still, and I was pretty much the same colour as the rocks. So I didn't stick out. And I could see him sort of looking like, could he smell me? Could he see me? And I thought, I haven't moved. And we had this amazing moment of locked eye contact, which is probably about 30 seconds, but felt like 3 minutes. And then I thought, actually, he just wants to come through. He wants to get across there. So I gestured with my head. And as soon as I gestured with my head, he went, whoa, and sort of ran off and then ran up behind me. I could hear him coming round this side. But yeah, it was one of those moments, because my paranoia was that, and what runs through your head is like going, well, what happens if he decides that I need to be evicted or that I'm a threat? And then I had this sort of, the flashed image of my naked, gored body being found on the mountain. They were saying, what was he doing with that goat?
Yeah. What did he do with that goat?
It's not the epitaph that I really wanted. It's like,
yeah.
I mean, it won't bother me, but, my family might be a bit.
Yeah. Brilliant. Wow. Yeah, it's so powerful, isn't it? I mean, it is, especially in that situation when you're exposed and you're kind of out of your kind of natural place or center in a way. I mean, maybe more in your personal center, but not in your environment. You're in their environment.
Well, especially I found when I was a marine biologist, I obviously did a lot of diving. And there, you're in another world. It's definitely not our world. It's very much their world, and you are in that inner blue space. But yeah, the extraordinary encounters, particularly with very big fish, and the odd shark. But I mean, I had some encounters in New Caledonia with the large groupers that you get on the reefs, and these fish are huge, size of my desk, and they would come right up to you, and they were fascinated. They were like, what are you? I don't think you'll fit in my mouth, but maybe I'll have a nibble if you stick out a lip.
Yeah. Wow. There we go. Back again.
Yeah, so I think you have these encounters with very large fish, and even the small stuff for that matter. But I mean, it's like you very much are an interloper into their world, and a very temporary and ephemeral one. And yet you can still have these sort of playful moments, especially with other mammals as well. And I've dived with seals in the Sea of Cortez in the Gulf of Mexico. And that was extraordinary. Sorry, not Gulf of Mexico, Baja California. It's a completely different wrong coast.
Yeah, wrong side.
But the sea lions, they're amazing. And they're so much sleeker than we are underwater.
Yeah,
so,
the grace of those animals when they're in the sea. Yeah,
they're just extraordinary. I mean, I was talking about them the other day, because I've been up in North Norfolk, and looking at as you say, you see the seals basking out on Blakeney Point and on those North Norfolk sand flats, and they are pretty ungainly on land, but put them in the water, oof, away they go. And also, I think there's something about that sort of between worlds thing as well. When I lived in Orkney, in Stromness. I used to walk around the headland on the edge of Scapa Flow. I had a nice little circuit walk I did. And the first time I did it, you get that sense of being watched, and you're like, oh, and then, I sort of looked over my shoulder. I couldn't see anyone around. And then I looked out into the bay, and there were like half a dozen seals, just sort of sat there bobbing. And it became like a joke, I'd sort of laugh to myself because every time I did this walk, the seals were there. And, I would just sort of imagine them sort of going, oh, yeah, he's a bit late today. Yeah. Where's the rest of he's going? He doesn't seem to do anything. He just goes round and round in circles. No, it's not going anywhere.
Looks a bit cross today, doesn't he? Yeah.
I love the seals gossiping to themselves.
Yeah. I had a wonderful experience of Blakeney with the seals, where the tide had pretty much gone out enough that everybody on a boat had gone back in, and I was in a little motorboat, which I just basically let drift out on the last of the tide down through the harbour and out around the end of the point. And at that time there must have been about 800 seals all on the sandbank on the west side, on the Stiffkey side. And as I just drifted past them, they were all kind of looking at me, and as I went past, they'd just start dropping into the water one by one in a line. And then they'd all pop up, and they were kind of all swimming like this behind me. And literally all of them got in the water as I went past, and they were all following me. And I was completely wrapped, just kind of in awe of, I didn't know what they were doing, but they're kind of human looking as well. Yeah. And some of their movements. And it was just like a load of breaststroking bald men were kind of, very heavily tanned sort of.
It's eyes on the front of the head. It's eyes on the front of the head. Is the
exactly. You're right.
Right back at you. In a way that a bird, apart from an owl, looks at you from the side, as does a fish. But a seal looks right at you. When I used to go sea kayaking on the west coast of Scotland at Arisaig, and the trick there when the seals came along, they love to pop up behind your kayak, and just follow along behind you, follow like they were doing with your boat. So what you do is you just paddle backwards, So you paddle backwards, they pop up at what is actually the bow of your canoe as you're going that way, and they're not expecting to see your face, so they and they sort of go, whoa. I wasn't expecting to get eyeballed. I thought I was going to be safely looking at the back of your head.
Yeah. Bloody hell! Look, he's a seal. Oh. Yeah, shit. They have eyes. Yeah. There was a wonderful one. Another seal moment where I was sailing back into the harbour, and it was a really gentle breeze, almost not moving, just coasting along really slowly. And this seal came up behind the boat, almost with its nose touching, it was like, I don't know, 2 inches away from the keel at the back, from the rudder rather. And it just started spinning, like as if it was on a point. So its whole body it was swimming along, but it was just kind of rotating 360 degrees, just kind of just purely enjoying himself and sort of saying, look what I can do,
Yeah.
But we were just looking at each other as well, because I was sat at the back with the tiller, just again transfixed. And it was so, and there is that thing anyway of, if you've ever sailed, there's just the quiet of sailing compared to an outboard, where there's just the sound of the water rushing alongside the hull, or even then when it's quite slow, you just got these beautiful lapping sounds and a bit of canvas sound from the sails, or so tranquil and peaceful, and then this kind of ballet of the seal at the back.
I think there's one thing, I mean, that's such a beautiful image and experience, and I think there's something again which I sort of got from the School of Myth, was this idea that nature doesn't want to be saved. Nature wants to be appreciated. Nature wants to be adored in the same way that any of us, you know, perhaps might aspire to be adored and valued and appreciated. And I always like remind myself of that, to go into wild spaces or even in my garden, you know, with that sense of adoration in mind, to sort of radiate it, you know, consciously. And there was a little dove that was a little turtle dove that was nesting in my wisteria, which always sounds like a bit of a euphemism. But you know, and this dove like sat on its eggs through, you know, us having lunch underneath it, and you know, there was loads of noise and coming to and froing, but I sort of made a conscious effort just to sort of focus on the dove and reassure it that, you know, you're fine, you know, your eggs are safe, your nest is safe, you know, we're here, but we're just going about our business. And I think there's something about bringing that attitude of adoration, not walking in and going, well, come on, nature, impress me, you know, make my day, you know, show me something wonderful, but actually just, you know, appreciating the tiniest things and bringing that radiation or radiance of adoration with you.
Yeah, it's a remembrance. For me, it's just remembering that you are nature. It's a kind of coming back home. And because animals are so aware, so sensitive, literally sensitive, and can feel and sense things, you know, often way beyond our capacities, even if we were operating at full power, which we're not when we're in our heads, because we're kind of closed down our senses. So nature can sense what's going on with you. Nature, you know, in any, and I'd say nature meaning all of nature, you know, plants, animals, all of it. It can feel what's going on, you know, all of the time. So whatever you're bringing is immediately sensed by the environment, and it responds, you know, in kind, or to kind of accommodate usually. You know, it's like, I always feel like nature's kind of looking after its slightly deranged toddler, which is humanity, and it's got a lot of patience, a lot of love,
a lot of forgiveness,
a lot of forgiveness, and just, oh, it's all right, you know, it's just, you know, they're just doing what they do, they're all right, they'll get there one day, you know. There's a lot of that going on. That's what I feel, you know.
Oh God, yeah, this kind of terrible childlike anthropological id let loose on the world.
And this, the kind of the insanity of this saving the world. I mean, that's just a human mental illness, right? The world's like, what? Are you serious?
No,
God, don't save the world. We've seen what you can do. Please don't try and save us.
yeah. No, I said, I mean, I wrote a piece like that last year. Just, you know, it was called "The End of Saving the World." Just saying, you know, stop saying saving the world.
It's ourselves, isn't it? I mean, it's our own kind of. It is a mental illness. I mean, we're culturally insane, is what we are. Individually, I think there's a lot of sanity and a lot of healing going on, but culturally, we are at peak insanity.
Pretty much. I mean, in actual fact, you know, there's a whole strain of environmentalism which is actually, you know, even worse in a sense, which I get particularly sort of exercised by, you know, where it all became about specific animals and clean air rather than, you know, a relationship with the earth, you know, rather than going back to that deep-rooted indigenous wisdom about interdependence and interconnectedness. It became so utilitarian. It became, you know, completely anthropocentric. It's like, well, you know, we can't breathe, and we want to look after the, you know, the charismatic megafauna with wet noses and brown eyes and fur. You know, and sure, those are good roots in, but, you know, as you say, it's not about that. You know, we essentially destroyed most of our indigenous wisdom in the UK and burnt them at the stake, for you know, for very, very spurious justifications and reasons. And yet when you travel and you still come across incidences and examples of that deeper wisdom, of that deeper connection, it's really quite moving. I mean, one of the most amazing places I ever visited was Mongolia, and just the complete immersion of life within a natural system, and a very, very closed, quite localized system, and in such a deep relationship with livestock. I mean, the traditional nomadic Mongolian herders pretty much live on meat and milk. Certainly don't plant vegetables, and they're totally dependent on that. And it was quite mind-blowing, to see how they not only lived off the flesh and the milk of their herds, but also how they burnt the dung to cook it, because there was no trees. And it was just like, wow, this is just like, I've never seen a human animal relationship quite so tight before in my life, and then connected again with the landscape itself. And yeah, it was astonishing and profoundly moving.
Well, it's and I, just like you were saying about the recovery of landscapes or ecosystems, like it can happen really quickly. I think that indigenized sort of route that we all have is just there. Give it a bit of time and it's right there. Switch it on again, switch the tap on again, and it flows quick. That I feel like in a way I've been on a kind of indigenization program, and my kids, who were born here in the building, whose first few years were completely immersed in this, are so much more aware and in tune with the environment than I'll ever be. And I'm consciously trying to learn, but they've just known it. That's all they've known.
Yeah.
And I see how quick, given the circumstances, that would just spring into life again, because it's kind of obvious, like all these things are. We're so inseparable from this thing that we've just created a kind of, or we've gone into a sort of interesting and kind of, I don't know what it is. It's some sort of evolutionary thing where we had to kind of develop this prefrontal lobe concept kind of living universe where we kind of got out of our bodies and into our heads and into this other place. And we've now created this kind of network where we're even further removed from ourselves. And there's maybe a force going on there, and a life form, a new kind of life form that is beyond my comprehension. But the sort of the origin, our human origin, is so close to plugging back in so easily. And in times of crisis like this, and when the shit does start to seriously hit the fan, it's going to be that ability to re-indigenize that will get us through any kind of situation. I think nothing else. Yeah, we might kind of just be an expendable part of a process that's bringing new forms of technological life into the universe. I don't know, but it's so close. It's so close.
Might be the tail end of something.
or just but again, to go back to the sort of web of life thing, even that, this idea of separateness, that we're distinct, it's purely illusory as far as I can tell. There is no beginning and end of humanity. It's a continuation, and things, there are endpoints, but other things have been evolving and continuing, and we're not separate anyway. We're massive communities of viruses, fungi, bacteria, so those things won't die out. So it all depends on how you look at it, doesn't it? We do see things as separate, but it's just an illusion of perception. It's not, as far as I can tell, the greater reality, because we're inseparable from our context, which is a mess of life bubbling around together, and overlapping and all over the place in a beautiful way.
I was at Wilderness. I was comparing a tent at Wilderness Festival the other weekend, the Forum, and we had Philip Pullman being interviewed by John Lloyd again. I was talking about earlier, and they were talking about this sort of indivisibility, this sort of connectedness. And John Lloyd said to Philip Pullman, he goes, "Your books, have been called fantasy books." And like Pullman's like, They're not fantasy, they're stark realism. You know, and they got into this amazing conversation about sort of panpsychism, you know, and the fact that everything has consciousness in it, and that our brains are just these weird aggregators that manage to collect some of that together, and to have consciousness actually sat as an entity amongst that sort of few pounds of grey fat that sits inside our skulls. And when they were talking about like this, I was like, there, my eyes sort of got wider and wider. And then John Lloyd says, well, you know, I'm less of a panpsychist and more of a cosmopsychist. And I'm like, okay, you lost me now.
Yeah.
We're on universal psychism. But there's probably something in that as well. You know, I think that it feels impossible to comprehend these shifts of perception. And that's one of the reasons, you know, I got so frustrated in the work, like we were talking before, because I just felt, you know, you can mess around in the surface waters of behavioral psychology and manipulating people and nudging them to do things, even if they're aware of it or not, and probably create some good social and environmental outcomes by doing so. But to me, that was just like the wind chop on the surface. And it just felt like, and maybe this is an eternal battle that humanity's always had, but it was just missing these far bigger and deeper questions around consciousness and connection, and the collective, and and the interdependence that you were just describing. That if you don't get into that deeper water, then you know, what the hell are you playing at? There's all these surface currents, you know, but there's these big, deep, abyssal currents which move much more slowly, but perhaps more inexorably. I mean, they're the things that in the ocean drive global ocean circulation, which control the climate. And we're so constantly distracted by the flick and flop of the surface chop that we miss these sort of gargantuan shifts that might be going on down below. And hence wanting to be a sort of deep sea diver of consciousness and connection, not a surfer of the superficial waves.
Well, we have any culture that has absolutes or certainties is clearly a completely underdeveloped culture, because all the evidence we've ever had shows us that we were wrong. So it's like to say then after that, after being shown that something is something and you know it, and to have a religion called science where you basically say you can find out these absolute truths, it's absurd. And so for me, it's the kind of irony of the colonization or the sort of genocide as well of North America or the Americas as a whole, was that we arrived there all arrogant, thinking we were the civilized people and they were the kind of savages. From what I can see, especially in North America, it seems like it was the other way around. They had this concept of the great mystery, which is like super advanced, is acknowledging you don't know what the fuck's going on, and having that at the heart of your cultural understanding is way more adult and developed than going there. We know what we're doing. We know, we've got it all worked out. It's childish, it's funny. I mean, it's funny, but like in a really dire way. Look at the disaster we're causing based on that kind of thinking, that we know what the fuck we're doing, because, and that we're separate. Those two things seem to be intertwined.
I think there's something really powerful you said there about sort of a cultural maturity that allows you to sit with discomfort and uncertainty.
Mystery.
Yeah.
The fundamental mysterious nature of reality, of consciousness, of being alive. I mean, at bottom, that's what it is. It's total mystery. It's the void, isn't it? These are the wise cultures that point to that go, this is what underwrites everything, is this complete mystery. It's the ocean. It's your deep ocean of the unconscious or the mystery or all of those things, all those places. And an acceptance of that, of the humble acceptance of that, of the greatness of that we're kind of facing all the time. is the only way to start a good way of life, as far as I can see.
That's why the podcast I do with Dougald Hine is called The Great Humbling, because it is about this. It's time to get on your knees. It's time to appreciate you don't have the answers. You need some reverence. You need to be grounded. You need to get down. There's a rat chewing through my wall. So I just get something scratching like this.
Pretty naughty, aren't they?
Yeah. But no, this idea of humbling, because it flies exactly in the face of that sort of arrogance and hubris and finding of answers and defining of solutions, that, as you say, has historically got us into like so many messes, one after the other, and had to rewrite things when we suddenly realized that everything you knew before now is wrong because we've discovered this. It's like, well, hang on, that's probably going to keep on happening. As your certainties melt away. And yet, in some ways, looking at the span of history, that should be the automatic reaction, shouldn't it? And they're going, well, the certainties are only certainties until we get the next discovery, in which case, can we all just chill out a bit and just accept some of the the fluidity of this in a slightly more lucid way, because clearly otherwise we're going to be putting far too many eggs in particular baskets, or building straw men and golden balls, only for them all to be turned on that. I'm mixing my metaphors now. I'm getting totally lost.
It's all patterns in the river, right? There it is.
Yeah, let's go back. Let's circle right back to the river.
Yeah, but it is. It's those eddies and the river is always mysterious and moving and changing. But you do get patterns, and some of them stick for a while. Where there's a stone, you get that eddy, and it kind of looks the same. It moves about, but then one day it's gone. I mean, this is it. It's like accepting. All around us, we're being told, aren't we, all the time? We're being shown by life. It's all sort of showing us this. This is totally amazing. It's totally mysterious. It's love. It loves you. If you notice it, you'll fall in love with it. Yeah. It's just all, it's going on all the time. That's what I like, and all these stories of disaster and saving the world, and things will happen, things will come, things will shift. There'll be tragedies and great shifts and changes. But life is just rolling on, and we're inseparable from that. So the fear of our ending, which is really what drives a lot of this thing, of all these things, is kind of it's the ego fear of our own death, isn't it? It's this kind of
don't get me started on death denial.
Oh God, shit! That's another conversing.
That's another conversation. Yeah, because I think I probably have to go in a minute, even though I'm absolutely loving this. But maybe we'll pick up death denial another time, because I do think that's part of the engine of all of this. It's the inability of the ego to accept that there might be an individual ending, even though, as you say, the collective nature party rolls on.
Yeah, death, good place to stop and start.
We found a definite ending on death.
Yeah, killed it. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. That was a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Great.